Okay, so here we are in Maya, and we have a hand that I've textured using Photoshop, and it's largely the same as the hand that we used in class. I modified it a little bit just because I was using photo reference from my own hand. So the nails are a little bit shorter and the knuckles are a little bit bigger, and that tended to make the generating of textures a little easier because I wasn't having to kind of stretch my nails onto long nails that didn't really exist. So if you are using your own hand as photo reference, then modifying the hand a little bit so that it more closely resembles what you might have photographs of could be a good workflow. But switching over to Photoshop, you can see I have my texture here. At the very top, I have UVs that I've exported from Maya, and we went over how to do that in our previous lesson. I have the top folder is reference, and this is just kind of containing all the different photos and different images that I used to reference to generate my texture. And then underneath of that, I have a color folder. And inside of here, I basically have all the different hues that I use to paint on my hand. And then underneath of that, I have a layer called shadows and highlights. And it's very important that you actually, if you wanted to use this workflow, it's very important that you structure your folders in this kind of order because the color needs to be on top of the shadows and highlights because we're using blending modes. So if I turn off this folder, you can see that it's just black and white. So everything that's in my shadows and highlights folder is just black and white images. And the reason that I do this is because I'm using multiple photos that have different lighting and kind of different pigmentation on the skin. Like all these images are kind of different, taken at different times of day. But what you can do is when you do copy them, you can shift them over to black and white, and it makes them a lot easier to blend together. But let's just look at a quick example of how blending modes work so that I guess the folder structure makes a little bit more sense. So here I have a Photoshop file, and it's just a black and white image of a sphere. And so the background is gray, and I've made a new layer here, and I'll just name this color. And by default, Photoshop, when you make a new layer, sets the blending mode to normal. And so all that means is that if I were to use my brush tool and pick, I don't know, just a green color here, and I paint on this paint in the layer, it's just going to be exactly what the color is. It's not going to change it at all. So if I paint over this sphere, it paints right over it. You can't see anything underneath of it. But if you were to shift this to overlay, which is the blending mode we're going to be using for our texturing process, it changes how the layer behaves. So now the color layer actually looks at everything underneath of it, and it will adjust the color that you paint in the layer. So right now I'm still using the same green color, and if I paint here on the solid gray, it doesn't look like much is happening. But if I paint over the sphere, you can see that it's actually looking at what's going on this background layer, and it's changing the green value to match the shadows. So if I create a kind of marquee selection around this sphere, and I just drop a paint bucket tool, it looks like now it's a green sphere that has lighting information on it. And if you notice, because it's overlay, if I switch it back to normal, it's just the green color. But because it's now an overlay mode, it's looking at the shadow information and it's changing the color so that it more closely matches all the shadow information. So why we can use that in our hand texture is it's really useful. We can just concentrate on getting really good shadow values from reference photos and then shift over to painting color. So we can kind of break up the texturing process into multiple steps. Instead of having to paint shadow and color at the same time, you can just work on shadows and then paint color afterwards. And what that also means is that if you ever want to adjust kind of the underlying hues of your texture, you can always go back, and this is just a solid color layer, you can shift the color and it will update with a single click instead of having to repaint your entire hand. So moving on from here, I'm going to go ahead and turn off the color and shadows so that you can see what it's like to start from the texturing process from the beginning. So if I turn those both off and I save, I can switch back over here to Maya. You can see that it's now back to just being a black and white image, and that this is basically our jumping off point. The base layer is just a background that I filled with a 50% gray. And to make sure that you're getting 50% gray, you can click your little color palette and kind of drag it over here so that everything is zeroed out. And then here in this, where it says B, you can type 50, and that'll give you a 50% gray. And I'll make a new layer here, fill that in, and just title it background. And no, let's get going. Okay, so here in my reference, I'm going to want to start with a finger, maybe. So if I use this image, I can just cut out kind of the best one of these fingers to use as my jumping off point. So it looks like the middle finger is kind of facing the camera, the closest. So if I just do a lasso select around the whole thing, including some of the knuckle that's here in the hand. And the lasso select is located over here on the left. I then, with the layer, the reference layer selected, I can copy either using Control C or Edit Copy, and then just paste right in place. So it makes this new layer here, and you can see that it's separate if I switch to my Move tool, which is located up here at the top. So now I just have a finger. I'm going to turn off my reference image and move my new finger outside of my reference image and shrink it down. Oop, it didn't quite get out. 1 second. So if I move it outside of my reference layer here, over top of my background, I can remove all the color value by using an adjustment. And so you can do an image adjustment here by selecting Image, Adjustments, and then Hue Saturation. And it should bring up a window that looks like this. Alternatively, you can also say Control U, and that's the hotkey to bring that up. I do that a lot because I use this operation quite a bit. So here you have your 3 sliders. The hue will adjust the color. The saturation will either remove color information or add more of the same, so you can oversaturate your image. And then you have a lightness and darkness slider, so you can make it all the way black or all the way white. The only slider we're interested for right now is the saturation. So if we slide this all the way to the left, it'll remove all the color information from our image. So now we have a black and white. Now we have a black and white image. You hit OK instead of cancel. That we can use as our jumping off point. So turning on my UVs, I'm going to position this finger over top of in the general area where the middle finger would go. And you can stretch it and move it using free transform. And so to activate that, all I did was hit Control T, but you can also go to Edit, Free Transform, and then that gives you an indication that you're in free transform mode. And if you want even more control over where you're pushing and pulling things, which I kind of do because I want to get this knuckle up here, but I also want this to be there, you can go to the warp function. And inside of the warp function, you can just kind of mush inside of these boxes and shift different zones independently instead of all of them transforming or being modified at the same time. So I'm thinking that looks pretty good. So now that we're just that knuckle, just a little bit better. So push this up, move this down, try and keep the wrinkles on the knuckle kind of running in a more horizontal fashion. Cool. All right. Then you hit enter to accept all of your changes. Now you have your finger. You can turn off the UVs and hit save. And so because this file is the one that my Maya file is referencing, if you switch back to Maya, um, it should automatically kind of update your texturing so you can see what's going on. Right now, got my knuckle and I got it in place. It looks pretty terrible, but we're going to add a few more things to try and get this blending in better with the rest of the texture. So switching back to Photoshop, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a mask to this. And so down here, you can see this little thing. It kind of looks like a camera, but if you click that, it will add this little icon next to your image. This is your mask. And so by default, it is white, means that it shows everything that is in your layer. If your mask icon is selected, you can actually paint inside the mask just using your brush tool. And so if you switch over to a black value, that will hide everything. And if you switch to a white value, that will reveal everything. So how this can be used to really efficiently and effectively mask objects is by starting from where you're revealing everything, and then paint only using a little bit of flow at a time. So up here on your brush, making sure that the edge of your brush is set to be soft, so the softness of your brush is set to 0. You can adjust the flow of your how many pixels are coming out of your brush at the same time. You can dial that all the way down to maybe just like 3 or 2. And so then when you're clicking, it doesn't hide everything all at once, but you can gradually just kind of paint out the information that you don't need. And I'm going to dial this up just a little bit so that it goes a little faster. Good. All right. Okay. And so say you accidentally masked an area that you didn't intend to mask. So you can easily, so right now it's set to black. If you just flip back over to white and you paint, it will reveal the stuff that you hid. And so the key with what's going on here is this is called a non-destructive workflow. So if you had actually, I'm just going to duplicate this layer to show you, if you actually just had your finger and you just started erasing what was there, that information's gone forever. So if you ever did want to kind of undo that, the only way to do that is to go into your history and undo that erase that you just did. But if in between erasing you had done other important things that you like in your texture, all of those will get removed too. So it's better to just have a mask on here, and you can go back and forth and paint what you want and what you don't want, and you never have to worry about using your history to remove anything that you may have messed up on. Okay, so at this point, it's still, even though I've softened the edges, the look of the image is still really drastic from the gray underneath of it. So if I save this and I flip back to my model, it's looking better, but it still sticks out a lot. So what I want to do is kind of adjust the black and white values in a way, like all at once, in a way that is easy to control. So to do that, I'm going to add a curves layer. And so the curves are located down here at the bottom. It's this little half circle. If you click it and then you say curves, it adds this adjustment layer. And what I want to do is I want to connect this adjustment layer to this layer, because right now this curve is going to adjust all of the stuff that's underneath of it. But really I only want to affect this one right here. So if you hold Alt and you hover your mouse over the middle of the layers, you can see that the icon shifts to look like a little right angle with an arrow. And when you click that, you can see that now these layers are linked. So now the curves layer is only going to affect the layer that's right underneath of it. Okay, so the curve layer is pretty powerful because you can, over here on the left, you can see these are the darkest darks, and on the top and over on the right you have your brightest brights. So if I were to move that point up to about halfway, that would remove all the darks and they would turn them gray. And if I click this point and I move it down, it will remove all the lights and it would make them gray. So now the image is completely gray, which I don't want. But I can easily just slide it back and slide that up a little bit. And what I want to do is I want to crunch the values so that they are hovering more closely to the middle, about 50%, and maybe adjusting some of the ones that are a little darker. So I encourage you to just kind of play around with the shape of the curve until you get something that more closely resembles the kind of shadow information that you want. So at this point, I like what's going on about right there. Maybe, yeah, about like that. So then when I save and I flip back to Maya, you can see that now this is really blending in with my gray much more smoothly. And so the process to end up getting all the way to a black and white gray shadow texture where it's looking like this, it's exactly the same. So I'm basically just cutting out fingers, placing them where they're supposed to be, adjusting them with a curve, and then once I'm happy with it, I repeat the process. So if I were to duplicate this, and shift this over to where my other finger is, I can then merge all of this together into a single layer, and then I have my black and white values. So this process, the first time you go through it, should take quite a while just because it will be new. But just to give you a little bit of a reference, I've got all of my pictures that I use to create my texture here. So I have a top and a bottom and a side of the finger, and then also a fingertip is all by itself. Um, and I went through the same process of kind of cutting out the part of the image that I wanted, changing it to grayscale, and then adjusting its curves, and masking it out and to blend it all together. And after all that, you end up with something like this. So this grayscale value, we can now start to add color to. So right now I just saved, and if I switch back over to Maya, you can see that it has updated the texture with the grayscale value of the texture. But we don't want a grayscale value, we want a color value. So here I'm going to flip my color layer on and then kind of walk you through the different color values that I have over here. I have 4. The base layer is based on my skin tone, so it's kind of a Caucasian skin tone. Then over top of that, I have a blood layer, what I'm calling a blood layer, and that's kind of simulating where the blood flow is under the skin. And then I have a veins layer, so that's kind of a bluish color. And then I'm just painting in some very subtle veins. And then over top of that, I have a hair layer, and that's set to brown. And I've just kind of penciled in with a thin brush to simulate some hairs on the hand. And these layers are what's known as solid color layers. So to make a new solid color layer, all you do is click the same button that you clicked to make a curve, but instead of curves, you select solid color. And then you get to pick whatever color you want. So if I try and duplicate the color that I started with last time, something like that. And this automatically generates a mask along with it. And the mask that's generated by default is set to reveal all the color. And you can always flip that by either selecting a paint bucket and then going to paint bucket and selecting black, and then you can just, with your layer, clicked and active. If you click in there, it will hide the whole color. And alternatively, if you fill it with white, it will reveal the whole color. The shortcut for inverting colors, which is kind of useful, is Control I, and you can just flip whatever is currently in there to its alternative, which is kind of cool. So if you started with, if you don't want to see all the color to begin with, which is kind of what I wanted to do with my blood layer. So if I have my base layer here, base 2, and I generate a new blood layer, solid color, kind of something more dark red here. I don't want the blood layer to be visible the whole time. So if I select my mask and I hit Control I, it will hide everything. And then the process that I use that's been pretty good is to go in and slowly paint back in a mask which will reveal the color that is here. So if I switch my brush, or if I switch over to brush mode and then I make sure that the color that's active is white, when I paint here you can see that it's revealing the color that is here. So if you have a really low kind of flow on the brush, you can just slowly build it up in the areas where you want to have color, or where you want that color to be visible, basically. And so this is definitely like, this is the place where I tend to spend a lot of time, because it's, you have to do a little bit of work here, save, flip back over to Maya. Oh, you're like, oh yeah, that's starting to look like something. And then you go back and start to paint some more in, and eventually you'll end up with your blood layer all set up. And the process is the same, or I use the same process for the veins and the hair, where I generated a new solid color. For the veins, I chose kind of a blue, or kind of more of a dark blue. And then I selected the mask, I inverted it, and then just very slowly went in and kind of painted in kind of some blue areas where I'm kind of fake having some veins. All right, well, cool. So I'll go ahead and flip those back on. So you can see by breaking up the shadows and the color into two separate folders, it really gives you a lot of flexibility, because I could come in here and just make a duplicate of my color layer, hide one of them, and then create a whole new color scheme just by double clicking in the solid color layer. I could adjust this to a darker skin tone, and I could adjust the blood to a different color so that it shows up a little bit better with the new skin tone. Adjust this maybe a little bit closer down that way. And so when you save that, you can see how quickly you can generate a whole new color, color value for your object, and you've really only